It's funny. I don't think I've added you as a contact yet on my phone, and it says maybe Adam Catherine. I'm like, okay.
Hello, and welcome to Radio K number 9. I'm Adam Kadri. Maybe. This time around, we have more interactive fiction from 2005, but first we have our last game from 2004, which won the annual interactive fiction competition that year, Luminous Horizon by Paul O'Brien. Like I mentioned last time, this segment got delayed a little bit because the original guest had some issues, so stepping in to pinch hit on this one is Stacy Tappan. Now, back in Radio K number 1, I talked with Jess Haskins about a game called Another Earth, Another Sky, and Luminous Horizon is the sequel to that. It's the third and final game in the Earth and Sky series. So, my first question to Stacy was the same one I asked Jess, that is, how familiar she was with superhero comics. And the answer turned out to be familiar enough that we ended up talking about Deadpool and Hawkeye and all of them for 3 hours. So, I figured I should probably edit that part out. I also asked Jess whether she had played the first Earth and Sky game, and she said that she had deliberately avoided doing so to see how well the second one stood on its own. But Stacy did play the first 2 Earth and Sky games before playing Luminous Horizon, so here she is to get you caught up.
So the first thing you have to know about Earth and Sky 3 is that it's 3. There are 2 games that come before this, and much in the tradition of comic books, it's a serial story. So the things that have happened in the previous games lead into this one. So you have a brother and sister team who have discovered 2 super suits that their scientist parents have made as they are researching why their scientist parents have disappeared. And they go off with their suits on a quest to rescue them. And they have just gotten back from a trip to another dimension and discovered that a creature from that dimension, an alien scientist, has come through to our world with the aim of destroying it with biological tampering. And they're trying to rescue their parents from this creature. And their search has led them to the middle of a desert, and that's where we start off. One of the characters is able to fly, blast electricity, and create fog. This is Sky. And the other one, Earth, has strength, is able to punch things and lift heavy things, and also has a resistance to electricity.
Theoretically has resistance to electricity.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, I believe that resistance got taken away from him in the second game, perhaps? I'm not sure. Or has that never been tested?
Oh, you can test it all right. In the first game, when you're playing Sky and Austin is standing there in his Earth suit telling you how to test your powers, you can type Zap Austin, and he'll scream, "Emily, wait, stop, what are you doing?"
I did do that, but that didn't, for me, establish whether it was or not. It just established that it was untested.
But here's the thing.
Uh-huh.
Austin will scream, "Don't do it."
Uh-huh.
You can do it again, and you kill him.
Damn.
And then it just says, star, 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 you have killed your brother, star, 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 the end. So...
Damn,
yes.
Earth and Sky.
Yeah,
Would it be dark? Dude.
You can actually kill him dead with an electrical zap in the first one if you really...
Holy crap. Yeah, I'm not surprised that I didn't try that because I generally don't want to kill my brother. That's interesting.
Well, since we're talking about Earth and Sky 1, let's start there. Like I just said, in the first Earth and Sky game, you play Emily, Sky, and then in the second one, you play her brother Austin, Earth. In Luminous Horizon, you can switch back and forth between the 2 of them whenever you want. And in fact, a lot of the game is built around this mechanism. A lot of the puzzles are a matter of saying, like, okay, Austin, use your power. And now Emily, use your power. And now Austin, use your power again. And hooray, now the door is open. Let's go through. So what did you think of all this character switching?
I enjoyed the strategy of changing, of switching the characters, figuring out who you want to do what, and also seeing the game through the 2 different characters' eyes. Because sometimes the descriptions are slightly different according to who is looking at them. And I found that was very interesting in terms of like replaying the game, to see the different dialogues and perspectives that they offered. And I felt like it could have even gone further in that direction, but I liked the idea of it. I will say that although smashing things is very satisfying, especially when you've been frustrated by puzzles in the past, I enjoyed playing Emily a lot more because it feels very liberating to be able to fly. She was able to access more places than Austin was. She could zap things, so she had an offensive power like he did, but she also had a defensive power, the fog. So it felt like she had like this all-round capability that he did not. And I felt more equipped playing Emily for most problems. And Austin, I sort of left until there was no other solution but brute force. I agree with you that the game felt like it was tailored around this conceit that you had to change characters and that the characters had to cooperate and they could only do it acting in turn in a specific order. But I mean, I feel like that was the point of the game, so it didn't bug me. There aren't a lot of games where you switch characters, as far as I've played. Maybe I just haven't played enough games, but it was a novel enough conceit for me that I enjoyed planning it out.
Well, lots of things I want to say about that. I guess the first would be, you talked about preferring to play Emily, and now I kind of want to see a study to see who different players would pick as their default character to be, if any. Because thinking back on my own playthrough, it occurred to me that I actually did tend to switch back to Emily when there wasn't any particular reason to play Austin. And this is probably going to sound weird, but I think that some of that might be because it felt lighter. Like, literally, the somatic sensation of playing Austin and being sort of a ground-bound character made me feel heavier sitting at my keyboard. So I would actually switch back to Emily to sort of take some of that weight off.
That is a really interesting observation. And I think it speaks to the success of the writing in that through the abilities of the characters, you actually kind of take on a bit of a feeling of what it's like to be them, which is probably why it feels liberating to fly in this game. It's because you feel that liberation through the writing.
Of course, what we haven't mentioned here is that Emily and Austin are of different sexes, so I imagine that by saying that I defaulted to playing Emily, I'm inviting more pseudonymous commenters to tell me, this just goes to show that you're suffering from gender dysphoria.
What?
Yeah, well, this is the life I lead. But the thing is, I remember taking a class in college in which a guy announced to the class that he couldn't play a video game as a female character. Like, it just freaked him out too much.
Wow.
I thought that was pretty bizarre, but apparently it's not completely anomalous.
Maybe as a female, I have a different perspective, but I didn't feel especially like Emily or Austin felt particularly female or male to me. I mean, maybe their sets of skills are sort of gender typical for superheroes, but there was nothing about either of them that sort of reinforced gender stereotypes. They both seemed fairly neutral on that score. You know, neither of them expressed sexual interest in anybody. Neither of them dressed up particularly. In the first game, when you meet Emily, she's wearing like a sweatshirt and sweatpants. So it doesn't feel to me like they are written in any sort of gender typical way, apart from the skills. So yeah, it would be interesting to see if anybody actually reads them that way, because I certainly didn't feel that, I don't know, that, oh, I'm playing the girl now. You know, I didn't ever feel like that.
Now, another thing you said that I wanted to respond to was about how smashing things was a satisfying change of pace from the usual IF puzzles.
Yeah.
And I'd go so far as to say that that's actually the number one thing that the Earth and Sky games have going for them. It is, in fact, a lot of fun to come up against a door, and instead of having to go poke through a million rooms looking under and behind everything trying to find the key, you can just beat the door down.
Just smash it. Absolutely.
And Emily, too. There's a panel on the ceiling, and in every other game, you'd be like, how am I going to get to the ceiling? But in this one, it's just like, fly! Okay! Fly! And there's the panel right there. It's like, yes!
Okay.
All right! So that is fantastic. But in terms of exploring the things that you can do with your powers, using them laterally like Rapunzel does in Tangled, or just playing around with them, there's not a whole lot of leeway for that. And that brings me to my big talking point about this game, and I guess this is as good a time as any for it. So, as noted, Luminous Horizon won the comp in '04, and the comp is for games that can be completed in 2 hours. You know, the whole idea behind the IF comp when Kevin Wilson started it in 1995 was to encourage people to write more short IF so that we could get 20 games a year instead of 2, and so that people could pick up a game and play it in an evening instead of having to commit 3 months to it, the way you had to when you were playing an Infocom game or a lot of the early games in the hobbyist era. And Paul O'Brien, who wrote Luminous Horizon, was also, in the early days of the comp, its most comprehensive reviewer. He wrote good-sized reviews of every comp game for the first 10 years that the comp was around. And one of his big complaints was that as soon as authors realized that comp games got played and other games generally did not get played, those authors would just submit their games to the comp no matter how big they were. And so a lot of games that went into the comp were way too large to be played in 2 hours, sometimes even with a walkthrough. And Paul was one of the few reviewers to call this out and mark these games down. So here Paul is practicing what he preaches. Luminous Horizon is not too expansive. And that's great. You know, a few episodes ago, I was complaining about The Dreamhold by Andrew Plotkin and how there were over 60 rooms full of stuff accessible right from the beginning. And that's just as far as I got before I just got totally overwhelmed and gave up. But it feels to me like Paul goes to the other extreme here. At any given time in Luminous Horizon, there are at most like 5 rooms you can go into, and only 2 of them have anything in them. Most of the time, there's only one useful thing that you can do, and a lot of the time you can't even leave the room. You just have to sit there and try things until you hit upon the one thing that will advance the plot, or until your sibling just tells you what to do. You can't go somewhere else and work on a different puzzle, because it's one thing at a time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to me like most IF is linear like that, in that you have to solve this thing before this thing can happen. But I think you are a little bit more limited in your options in this game. Like in the final battle, it's like a 1-turn elimination. You know, you either get it right or the game ends. So I was trying different things and I wasn't getting any hints as to why this thing didn't work. And it was eventually, this person has to do it. And not this thing, but this thing. And there didn't seem to be anything in the descriptions to lead me to that choice. It was just random, guess the action, guess the player, and that felt unsatisfying, especially for the final puzzle. You want it to be the grand finale, you want it to sort of synthesize the things that have come before and make it like a satisfying conclusion. And instead I was just guessing and dying and guessing and dying and guessing and dying. And that's not satisfying gameplay.
I kept guessing wrong, so what I ended up doing was talk to sibling, get hint, die, because you get the hint and then it's too late to use the hint, so you die, and then you undo, and then you do the thing as if you had known the hint all along.
God, I didn't even think of talking to sibling. I just was trying because you would die. So what would be the point?
Well, since we seem to have moved on to talking about individual puzzles, let me ask you about this. The previous set piece is the one where you have to fight your parents, where the solution is to study the order of the parents' attacks, figure out when those attacks are simultaneous, using the flasher gizmos to reset their loops as needed, and then dodge at exactly the right moment, even though dodge is not a command. That, to me, was a very fiddly puzzle that in the end I only got right by just sort of randomly flashing and jumping and hoping that eventually the things would line up. What did you think of the fighting your parents puzzle?
That is an interesting puzzle because I figured out that was what you were supposed to do. And then the parents' things aligned on their own without my having to flash them.
Oh.
I was like trying to work it out. Okay, who needs delaying here? What do I do? And so I was pointing it at it and I was getting ready to do it. And then all of a sudden it aligned. And I'm not sure what exactly I did. I was changing characters. I was jumping. I was flying. But whatever I had done apparently synced them enough that it solved the puzzle without my having to delay either one of them. And that is an unusual approach, is that you can solve the puzzle entirely by accident just by doing random things.
Now I'm wondering whether anyone solved this puzzle except by accident. I did use the flashers, and I knew I was supposed to use them to reset the loops, but I didn't know how to do that. When I tried to do it on purpose, my timing was always wrong. I only solved the puzzle, if you can call it that, by using the flashers at random times.
And yeah, that is a little bit unsatisfying. I felt that it was really hard in that instance to keep track of where people were and what they were doing, especially when you were changing characters. And I have trouble in IF games like visualizing things. And I have a special trouble when there's a sense of urgency in the game, as there is in this scene. So if things are rushing to a head and you feel like you're being attacked and there's things you have to dodge and there's things you have to figure out, I will skim over the text and not take my time to read it because I feel that sense of urgency. And while that sense of urgency is very effective in terms of game playing, it's frustrating when you are dealing with a puzzle that involves visualizing something that you have to read very closely.
Well, now I'm thinking that for this segment, we should just run that last thing you said on a loop. Because I'm like you, and I think most people are like us, in that when I'm at the end of a book and everything's coming together, I'm not lingering over every line. I'm frantically turning pages and taking it all in as fast as I can. And as a writer, I mean, holy crow, if you can build that kind of momentum, why would you want to interrupt it? So it seems to me that it's antithetical to storytelling to put a puzzle at the end of a game that makes the reader put on the brakes and carefully comb the text for clues.
Yes. Puzzle and storytelling are at odds here.
And it's not just Luminous Horizon. This is endemic to IF. And I've thought this was kind of problematic for a long time. That's why in the chase scene in Endless Nameless, you're basically just entering the commands your companion tells you to. I wanted players to be pounding in commands as fast as they could type, or it doesn't feel much like a chase scene. But who knows? Maybe this advice is anachronistic, since Luminous Horizon is from 2004, and maybe in the 13 years since then, IF writers have started to pay more attention to pacing. But speaking of pacing, we're almost out of time, and so to start wrapping it all up, let me ask you this. This game won the comp. Not the whole Earth and Sky series, but just this part of it. So the question is, did it deserve to? Does Luminous Horizon stand on its own?
Again, I feel like Earth and Sky 3 would stand on its own, but I think it's a lot better if you play the first two games. You have more of a background and investment in the two characters. And even though it will tell the whole story, I think having been able to play both of them in the previous games gives you an appreciation for them in the third.
Well, you say it'll tell the whole story. Putting everything else aside, what did you think of Luminous Horizon as a story?
It feels a little thin. You don't get a lot of background for the villain besides general mustache twirling, I'm going to take over the world. So that feels a little comic book cliche to me. I think the idea of kids going to find their parents makes them more invested in it than it would be just, oh, we have to save these scientists. So that in itself gets me a little bit more invested. But I felt like the driving force behind the story was a little pastel colored, it's a little surface.
And I agree, but I would say that about the whole series. What I'm getting at is that on top of all that, I think Paul has introduced other issues by dividing Earth and Sky up into 3 games and saying that each one stands on its own. Because Earth and Sky has a 3-act structure very much like the script to a summer movie. The first Earth and Sky game is very much an Act 1. It's all set up and not a whole lot else. And the second one is very much an Act 2. It is a substantial adventure, but with very little in the way of setup or resolution. And this one is just the resolution. You locate the bad guy's base, you go into the base, and you fight your way through the base. And that's the whole game. And, when I was in high school, the one role-playing game I ever played was Champions. And the 14-year-old dungeon master who I played with generally did not come up with storylines that were all that compelling. They literally would start off with, you're sitting around your headquarters and the phone rings and you pick up the phone and it's the bad guy and he says, "Let's fight." So you go out to a field.
Well, what more reason do we need? Let's go.
So that's sort of what you would get. So it does sort of stand on its own in the sense that it makes sense to sort of say, all right, you're a super team. You're trying to rescue your parents from the bad guys. You've found their base.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go. But there's a difference between understanding a story and actually having an investment in it or caring about it.
Although I will say that the characters in this game have like a little bit of an attitude. They have a little bit of a personality. The personality comes through very clear in the dialogue. That makes it pretty compelling, even though it's, you don't have the background, so it's a little thinner. But I feel like that mitigates things quite a bit. You want to see what they have to say. They've got these dialogue options and you want to pick all of them because they all seem interesting and you're curious as to what the reaction's going to be.
Second person, always dangerous. I don't know. When it comes to the dialogue, this feels to me more like Kurt Busiek than Joss Whedon. I mean, we do get some sarcastic banter, but it's sort of the Disney Channel version of sarcastic banter.
Yeah, I can see that. But it does add color. I can't say that it doesn't appeal because it does. I've played IFs where the character's voice really is kind of bland. And so it was refreshing rather than have just stock standard answers to have a little color in them. Even if it's a cartoony color, I like the characters having a voice.
Fair enough. I mean, I've already played one game in the 05 batch that does have the colorless dialogue you're talking about, so I do see where you're coming from. But before we return to 05, any last thoughts on this one?
I just want to say one more thing, which is we've kind of been picking it apart, but overall, I found this game really fun to play.
You mean Earth and Sky as a whole, or number 3 in particular?
As a whole, and this one as well. I think the conceit is a good one, and I think the comic book aspect keeps it kind of light, and I enjoy that it's just this little fluffy confection of a game, but I also enjoy that it's got replayability in the dialogue options and in seeing it from different characters' perspectives. And overall, I left with a sense of fun. Regardless of any other problems or quibbles that I had with it, I felt like the game was fun.
Next up, we have Whom the Telling Changed by Aaron Reed, which took first place in 2005's Spring Competition. You play a villager in ancient Mesopotamia, listening to a storyteller recount an episode from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the entire town, as all of you are trying to decide what to do about the strangers who've come into your territory. By making the right comments and asking the right questions of the storyteller, you can try to steer the story a little bit and influence your people towards war or towards peace. The interface is unusual in that you can issue commands like in a regular IF game, but you can also just type in words that you find in the game text, which is a mechanism that I first encountered way back in 1997 in a game called The Space Under the Window by Andrew Plotkin. And back to talk with me about Whom the Telling Changed is Catherine Moriarty. So I'm just going to say flat out, I think this is the best game I've played for this show since Savoir Faire back in episode 1. What'd you think?
I'm a fan of Aaron's work, obviously, but I am on record, probably a lot of times, as saying that the mid-2000s are a bit of a, I don't want to say a low point, but I would say things really don't start to truly pick up in quality until 2011 or something like that. And I think part of the reason is that in the 1990s, you had a lot of very explicit experiments. And then in the 2000s, you start to see a dwindling amount of interest, that sort of thing. And people started turning their attention more toward outreach, getting more people involved. It's a transition period is what it is. And this is one of the better pieces from it. And it's also fairly influential on a lot of things that came later.
Yeah, the idea behind this show is that I'm getting caught up, so these games from 05 are the most recent pieces of IF that I've played. But I am aware that other IF systems, such as Twine, have been developed since 05, and my understanding is that, like Whom the Telling Changed, they generally involve selecting emphasized words. Is that correct?
More or less, that's the basic mechanic. Obviously, there are a lot of different systems which have variations on it. Right now, texture is gaining in popularity, which is more of a drag and drop interface, but at the fundamental level of what you're doing, it's more or less the same idea as this.
And perhaps largely as a result of that mechanic, this is one of the first games that I've actually played, by which I mean, as much as I enjoyed Savoir-Faire, I didn't even really play Savoir-Faire. You know, I got stuck very early on, and I went to the walkthrough, and I typed in the commands from the walkthrough, and when I say that I really enjoyed Savoir-Faire, what I mean is that after I typed in the commands from the walkthrough, I went, ooh, at the responses, because they were so cool. And so there have been a handful of games that I've played. I liked the balloon one, To Hell in a Hamper. That was the first game I played for this show that I was able to get through without any hints. And Whom the Telling Changed was great in this regard. I got through it 3 times with no difficulty, got 3 different endings. It was a satisfying experience every time. But then I thought that a lot of people would argue back that, well, yes, of course it's impossible to get stuck in Whom the Telling Changed because it's just choose your own adventure. You know, you see the emphasized words and you type whichever word jumps out at you. But I don't think that that's exactly right, because I would say that even though the emphasized word mechanism puts Whom the Telling Changed maybe like halfway to choose your own adventure, I didn't feel playing this game the way that I felt as a kid reading through Choose Your Own Adventure books. You know, steering the story to accomplish the goal of your choice. And it is a bit of a software toy more than a game in that you kind of have to start off saying, all right, well, what do I want to accomplish? You know, being the peacenik, the first thing that I decided to do was I figured, all right, well, I think for an interesting little twist, I will start off by playing the warrior, but I will always pick like the most peacenicky kind of approach, and I'll see whether the game can handle me doing that as the warrior.
I also did that. It didn't go particularly well, but I tried it.
Well, it worked all right for me. But my point is, the fact that I had a goal, even if self-chosen, and the fact that I wasn't just picking emphasized words, but there were other steering mechanisms. There's listening to the other people's commentary and either agreeing with them or disagreeing with them or even mocking them. And the fact that you can also examine things and try other verbs and so forth as you are there. It's really not something that you could easily implement in hypertext. It felt more like I was at least driving the car rather than riding on the subway.
Right. I guess a lot of people are just, in the metaphor, opposed to transportation. There's this line of argument, which obviously has been around for a while and endlessly debated, about, oh, well, this kind of thing isn't real gameplay, or I'm not playing a game, or I have no control over the outcome, it's not interactive. There are just multiple variations on this. It's just a matter of the interaction you want to provide. In this case, it's pretty seamless. You have the interaction, which is you're elaborating upon or picking at or questioning or otherwise debating parts of a story that's being told, which happens to match up exactly with what you, the person, are doing in real life, which is prodding at the story that you are reading. It's fundamentally a game about storytelling and the ways in which story events can vary and reflect, mirror, play upon real life events. And so that kind of similarity is really good when it happens. And I would say that it is its own form of challenge. It's just that you have to approach it a different way. You don't really approach it in terms of, okay, well, I'm going to find the winning strategy to get through the story. It's just a shift. It's a shift that I'm not sure a lot of people really want from this kind of thing, which is valid. Obviously, personal preferences like that are valid. But I think a lot of the conflict comes from treating works like this, and especially works that go farther toward the hypertext end of things, as things that they're fundamentally not, and not really even interested in being.
Well, this highlights how there are two very different phenomena in interactive storytelling that both get called control. The promise of the parser is that you don't have just 2 or 3 choices. You can type anything you want, and the game will respond appropriately. Now, as authors, you and I know that that's largely an illusion, but it's still more true for IF than it is for Choose Your Own Adventure. But while you have a lot more control over what exactly your character does in IF, you generally don't have a lot of control over the story. There are exceptions, but generally the story is that once upon a time there was this adventurer who went someplace and solved some puzzles, and maybe if it's a longer game, the adventurer then went to a different place and solved some other puzzles. Whereas in Choose Your Own Adventure, you don't get to come up with anything yourself, but you can follow different paths to all sorts of places. Or to use another analogy, in IF, you are a chef, with apologies to Dan Shivitz. Like, you're given some apples and some flour and sugar and butter and cinnamon and things, and you're told you have to make an apple pie. But you can go about that however you want. In Choose Your Own Adventure, you're just ordering off a menu. But you don't have to order the apple pie. You can order chocolate cake or flan. So, which gives you more control? Depends on what you mean by control. Whom the Telling Changed hit a sweet spot for me. No pun intended. By allowing more turn-by-turn control than Choose Your Own Adventure, but also more power to shape the story than most IF.
Right, and in this it makes it very explicit. It just prints out the story that you facilitated, more or less. There's probably a more exciting word for it, but it gives you the story that resulted from what you did, just told more or less in the same fashion as the rest of it. It produces something that would stand alone if you're reading or telling it as a story, whereas with a lot of puzzle games, you can't really do that. Your story would be something like, oh, well, I just kind of unlocked the door, and then I just went into this room, and I just unlocked this other door, and I gave this key to the guard, and it's just not compelling as a story. Even if you have another story that it's in service of, the fundamentals of what you're doing just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I really like those recaps. I'm actually a fan of recaps in general. You know, when I was a kid, I loved getting an instant replay on Food Fight. And I was impressed by the level of detail that Whom the Telling Changed put into the recaps. Sometimes it was not super accurate. Like, it did not pick up on the fact that I was trying to be a peacenik as a warrior. In its little recap, it said that I started off wanting to kill the newcomers, and that wasn't true. But I wrote this down in my notes here. I did not actually make a lot of notes as I went, but I did write this down, that my first time through, the original storyteller tells me, "You made your case for peace tonight, but when a moment to prove yourself came, you did not act. Were you afraid?" And I wrote down, wow, that's a pretty sophisticated tracking of events. I was impressed by that sentence.
Well, when you mentioned not picking up on your intentions, that's probably, I would say, the number one complaint about this kind of storytelling, especially keyword-based storytelling. And I speak from experience here. I have one piece that uses a similar mechanic, and that's always the complaint, is that they don't know how what they are clicking or typing affects their output. Or perhaps their output is something that they weren't anticipating. And that's not really something that has an easy solution. If you're making something like this, you have to grapple with it in some way. I would say one of the more common ways around it is to present such choices as very explicit, obvious, this is a moral choice moment. I'm trying to think of a specific example here, but I believe there's a moment where the demon you're fighting surrenders, and it says, well, I wonder whether it was courage. I wonder whether it was cowardice. The thing about this, though, is that it kind of conflicts with another principle, which is that if you don't make this kind of thing incredibly obvious, then nobody's going to have any idea about the connections, even if to you they are completely obvious that it's almost embarrassing to write them. However, again, the more obvious you get in your writing, the further it gets from, I don't want to say quality per se, but it just removes any kind of subtext or nuance. And there are a number of moments when these things came up, and my thought was, I recognize this is a moral choice, but it doesn't really sound like anything a person would think. I don't really buy that these are the character's thoughts in this moment, but there's not really an easy way to do this without compromising on one level, but I can see why this was the one that was chosen.
Yeah, I guess I would say a few things about that. One is that there were a number of occasions in which I saw a pair like that, like courage versus cowardice, and I knew the effect that I wanted to achieve. Like, for instance, in my Warmonger playthrough, I wanted to say that we need to be courageous and fight these people. And so I would click courage, and I would hear my character, or see my character say something along the lines of, does it not show greater courage not to fight? Or something like that. And it's like, no, that's the opposite of what I wanted to get across by clicking on that word.
Right, that's part of it. Or another variation is I can't see how this particular word provoked this particular response. I understand this complaint. I understand where it's coming from, but it always makes me a bit frustrated, possibly, because in a lot of ways, that's kind of what I'm hoping to get out of things. And it's also true to real life. You don't always know how what you're going to say is going to affect things. Sometimes it has completely different consequences.
That is a very good point. That is a very, very good point.
Yeah, to say the least, right? And if you're approaching it as a game, then that is a major problem. Like, if you're thinking of it as this is a game, I need to win this thing, I need to do whatever it takes to beat this game, then yeah, that's going to be a major problem for you. But if you're going through a story, then not so much. You don't read a book and then get angry at it for not progressing the way that you thought it might go. Some people might, but that's not really...
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the entire fanfic industry is based on the fact that people do that.
Right, but they don't necessarily expect that it's going to be inherent to the book.
Right. Jennifer used to say that she wanted a button on her remote control that would make whichever characters were on screen at that moment start to make out. And while most fanfics seems to operate on that exact principle, the difference is that TV viewers don't think they have that button already, and IF players think they do. And it occurs to me, in saying that, I'm thinking of IF players as a them, because I've spent so much more of my life writing IF than playing it that I automatically look at these things from an author's perspective. But I haven't actually written anything like this. I've never tried writing a game based on keywords. I would guess that it's like a conversation tree writ large, but I don't really know firsthand.
This kind of writing is very difficult. And by that, I mean, when you're writing in this style, and especially if you're doing it where one of the options is to make the keywords non-obvious, then that gives you a huge challenge in your writing, because if you want something to be referred to, you need to mention that exact word or phrase somewhere in the writing, and you need to make it fairly obvious that it's one of the main subjects of this particular point in the story. But the other thing is that although you're limited to what's there, that's still a lot. And it's just this huge amount of things to implement, which is far more than any parser game could ever be. And it really does guide authors to that kind of very obvious, often object-based instead of theoretical moral choice, because it's a lot simpler to write. You can base it around concrete things like a medicine bag or a dagger, rather than hoping that they piece out the exact thing from your writing, which they don't usually do. I have a million transcripts of people not doing this, which is not their fault at all, but the extent to which it happens still is remarkable. And you see that in precursors to like the space under the window, which is farther toward the end of not being explicit about what happens. Some people like that a lot, and then some people approach it having zero idea of what they're doing. And it's really just a matter of, do I want the design to be a bit more intuitive and a bit more foolproof, or do I want to focus on the writing aspect of it and what effect I want to get across? And it's two things which don't really play nice with each other, I would say.
Well, as I recall, and it's been longer than I would like to admit, the space under the window was billed as interactive poetry, right?
Right.
It was one of those things where, yes, you pick words, and remind me, there was no emphasis function in Space Under the Window at all, right? You actually
Not that I remember.
Yeah, you were forced to sort of look at it and pick what you wanted. And you never really knew what sort of response you were gonna get. It really was just sort of a matter of poke and see, whereas I got the sense in Whom the Telling Changed that you really were supposed to have a sense of, accurate or not, of if I want to steer the story in this direction, I'm going to ask the teller a question about this thing. But if I want to steer the story in another direction and try to change the other tribespeople's minds in a different direction, then I'm going to ask the teller about this. It was somewhat more goal-directed and, prose versus poetry, even if the prose was in this sort of mythic voice that sort of straddles the line between prose and poetry.
That's one of the reasons why a lot of works of this nature are poetry, because it has the same constraint. You need to make every word count. Mythological stories don't necessarily have that, but they do have the same sense of gravity, I would say.
And I guess that's a reasonably good transition to talking about the actual content of this game. I had some trepidation early on with all the references to the people and tents and fire pits. I was worried that this would turn out to be some sort of unspecified prehistoric dream time, Neolithic,
quote-unquote tribal.
Yeah, animistic with some sort of generic mythology with the river god and the tree god and all that. And my interest jumped a lot when I discovered that, no, this is set in a particular time and place. It's post-Akkadian Mesopotamia. And I don't know, for some reason I'm much more interested in ancient history than I am in anthropology, even though I recognize that in a lot of cases the boundary between them is blurry or even non-existent. But yeah, call it history instead of anthro, and suddenly I do want to learn about post holes and granaries.
Yeah, not much of a fan of fake history, mostly because a lot of it tends to be very vague. A lot of it tends to be very bad, so I did appreciate that it was grounded in a real historical time period. It probably also helped with building the world, since you have the world. It actually existed. And there is a way to look up what things were like as far as we know in 2017 now, but in the mid-2000s then. And the other reason I would say that it does help is because I don't want to say most people have encountered the story of Gilgamesh, because they probably haven't, but it's something that can be encountered. It's something that you can look up and be familiar with the basic story. And I think that's crucial, because if you're trying to figure out what the story is at the same time that you're trying to figure out philosophical questions about it, it just wouldn't work as well. Like, it assumes that there's this basic familiarity with how things are probably going to go, just at a very broad level.
Yeah, for me it hit a sweet spot in that I had a vague familiarity with Gilgamesh, so it was recognizable, but it wasn't like one of the Greek myths I've heard 10,000 times.
Right.
One thing I find sort of interesting is that I've been listening to this world history course as I drive around for my day job, and the professor made the point that for every Sumerian tablet about Gilgamesh and Enkidu, there are around 100 about divining the future by examining sheep livers. But we only hear about the mythological ones because storytelling is still important to us as a culture, and divination is not really. But yeah, I will say that if nothing else, Whom the Telling Changed did make me want to read the book that Aaron Reed mentions in the afterword. I actually do want to know more about daily life in Sumeria now.
It's like the end goal of all educational IF, right there. It's like, oh yeah, I do want to read this book. This has done its job. But this isn't really educational IF, though, at all. In fact, it isn't remotely. And that's kind of I don't want to say my complaint, because it's really more a matter of personal preference. I feel that this is a story mostly about the aforementioned philosophical points, which have many parallels to politics, but I'm not really going into that because I kind of value not being collapsed in a heap for the rest of the day. So there is that.
It's interesting that the precise question the game poses of how do we deal with newcomers whose ways may not be entirely like our ways has so much more immediate resonance in 2017 than it did in 2005. It's an odd coincidence that you and I just so happen to have played this game during the whole travel ban fiasco, and more largely with rabid xenophobes having just taken over the executive branch of the government.
Or for that matter, the question of, well, is it even possible to reason with these people? Do you just have to fight them? Do you just have to punch the Nazi, or can you reason with them? Obviously, it's a bit more morally gray than that, but the question of how much violence is acceptable and what even constitutes violence in context is definitely something that's at the heart of a lot of discussions about current events at the moment. I'm sure we can all extrapolate upon those current events. The reason I bring this up, though, is because I think that the focus on that comes a bit at the expense of the fundamentals of the story. For instance, you're presented with an enemy and a lover, and for most of the story, that's more or less what they are. It does the thing where you look at your lover and it just says something about how much you're fond of them and how familiar you are with them, which on the one hand is preferable to certain things you can do with descriptions like that, but it does have a bit of a distancing effect. And then the rest of the story doesn't really expand upon that, which leads to problems when one of the possible endings is that your lover dies. And that's supposed to be a major emotional moment in the story, but since it's more about the philosophical points of the story, and we haven't really had much time to even know who this person is, it doesn't really have much effect. Well, I mean, that and the fact that it's a really common trope, but, there is that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I'm still going to give this game a thumbs up in that I think that it succeeds at what it sets out to do, and I thought that what it set out to do was really interesting. But yes, if you're looking for character development, you're not going to find much of it here. But, the game doesn't even signal that that's something that it's really interested in, and, not every game can do everything. But put it all together, and it sounds like here in episode 9, we finally found a game that I liked more than The Guest. Would you say that's the case?
I did like this work a great deal. It might not be as up my alley as a lot of IF works, but I certainly did like it. It's fairly solidly implemented. I only ran into one bug, which, again, I haven't seen the code, but what I assume is a fairly intricate tracking mechanism is quite impressive. And again, it's very highly influential on what came after it, so I do respect that as well.
Okay, well, I guess I'll be seeing that for myself in the years to come. Alright, we have a few minutes left, so let's take a quick look at Beyond by Roberto Grassi, Paolo Lucchesi, and Alessandro Peretti. It tied for second in the 2005 comp, and back to talk about it with me is Melissa Ford. And both of us gave up on this one. Why don't you start off talking about why?
Okay, so I'll admit I chose the game because I really enjoy horror, and this one was a horror mystery, and so I said, sounds like a great fit. And I have to say that my reaction is very much a personal reaction due to my life experiences. And I recognize that, and I think that's an interesting thing to talk about, which is what we bring into playing a game, because the author can't always know what somebody else is going to react to, because they have no clue, but their players come to the game already having experienced. So when I sat down to play the game, we're a few seconds into the game when you find out you're playing as an unborn fetus. So you've never been born, but then the unborn fetus describes themselves as dead. So one would argue that someone who has never been born can't actually be dead. It's hard to say what is translation and what is thoughts about embryos being placed into the game. So you're told, yes, you're dead. You've never lived a single day in your life. You died while you were still in your mother's womb. And we're told that it was maybe an accident, or maybe your mother just didn't have enough courage to let you come to life. But I brought into this a history of recurrent pregnancy loss. So immediately I was bringing in that emotion, and my heart just was not into it because it felt really cheap as a plot device. And it was, the setup that only someone who had never lost a child would use as a plot device. And so when you're talking about three men, young guys, and I'm making a lot of assumptions here, because for all I know, they're all married and have been experiencing recurrent pregnancy loss themselves. But I would tell you that there is nothing in the writing that made me believe that they had any personal experience with this. It was very off-putting. And I think you have people who get so excited over the idea of the plot device that they phone in any research or firsthand accounts and really understanding what they're doing to lend it that truth. And that lack of truth made it feel really cheap. And I get that we're talking about a horror game with a satanic priest, but...
Right. I think you've touched on pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, so I'll just add on to what you said. First, about the main character. Yeah, you're described as, quote, a nice little girl of about 10 years of age who's wearing a simple pink dress and has a long ponytail. But then, like you said, you discovered that you died in utero. As I recall, you weren't even a fetus yet, you were still an embryo. So already, this is the bullshit version of pregnancy from the anti-abortion pamphlets of the 1980s. I was conceived 2 weeks ago and I want to be called Katie and be a doctor when I grow up. You know, who someone will be at age 10 depends on a decade of life experiences. And even before that, on things like the hormonal mix she's exposed to during her prenatal development. I honestly don't know whether these authors aim to deprive women of their reproductive rights, but to elide the difference between an embryo and a school-aged child is a pretty standard move from that crowd. Then, of course, there's the line you pointed out when you're told that maybe your mother just didn't have enough courage to let you come to life. And framing the termination of a pregnancy as an issue of courage versus cowardice is, to be polite, a shallow and cavalier way to talk about a profound and fraught decision. But I do wonder how much of this is a matter of real ideology and how much is just a matter of assuming a particular cultural context. You know, as you mentioned, the bad guy in all this turns out to be a satanic priest. And to me, that's like, oh no, instead of worshipping fictional supernatural entity A, he's worshipping fictional supernatural entity B. But this game is set in rural Italy, I think it's the Apennines, and if your starting point is that priests are trustworthy and Satan is scary and Benedict XVI's doctrine on abortion is infallible, that'll underpin your game even if you don't mean for that to be what your game is about.
That's interesting because I really know very little about Catholicism. But, you know, regardless of what I believe or don't believe, it's always interesting to hear other people's ways of viewing the world. So I do feel like when you just kind of throw satanic worshiping priest in the end, you're expecting the player to come with a certain understanding versus clearly it's not in your belief system. So you're not getting the effect that they wanted at the end.
As to your point about feeling like your personal experiences are being treated lightly by authors resorting to cheap plot devices, you know, when I was a kid, John Byrne had a storyline in Fantastic Four about Sue and Reed losing their child, and it was handled pretty well. And then Chris Claremont ran with it, and it had this beautiful storyline in which Franklin Richards bonds with Kitty Pryde and tells her, I had a baby sister, you know, but she died when she was born. And obviously that spoke to my experience because my baby sister had died as well. And the thing is, even back then, I knew that in comics everyone gets brought back eventually. But I thought, you know, if anyone at Marvel dares to bring Valeria Richards back, that is beyond the pale. And sure enough, at the end of '01, the assholes who were on the book at the time decided that for a cheap plot twist, they'd undo Sue's miscarriage. And that just killed Fantastic Four for me.
I think that we want to see our own experiences reflected in what we read. And when the storyline feels so discordant with what we know to be the real emotions of the experience, it's not only off-putting, but I think that it brings up a lot of the frustration of being misunderstood once again. There's so many good stories out there. We don't need to take cheap plot devices in order to tell good stories. We can actually tell great stories and honor real experiences at the same time.
Well put. So you also brought up the issue of translation. And to me, that's what made this game unplayable. If you're going to translate something you've written into any language, you have to get someone who is, if not a native speaker, then at least 100% fluent in the target language, including having a complete mastery of idiomatic expression. I want to read some of the lines in this game. Anna is laying, dead, in the tub, sinked in the water made red by her own blood. It looks like the doll hasn't been moved since long time. Maybe he has also preceded us here to remove evidences. I think that last line is particularly emblematic in that it's not even the remove evidences part that's the problem. It's that native speakers wouldn't use the word preceded there. It's too formal. And a dictionary isn't going to tell you that. The English in this game isn't completely broken. It's not even half broken. It's like 10% broken. And that's good enough to, like, order in a restaurant or even to participate in a conversation on a message board, but it's not nearly good enough to write fiction. Not nearly.
As someone with a translation degree, I would sort of hope for more. Translation is an art form. as much as the writing itself, and choosing how you're going to translate, especially sort of the idiomatic parts of a language. Do you go for a literal translation? Do you convey what somebody reading it in its native tongue would understand? I thought it was a little bit of a clunky translation, but I was willing to forgive it in this free work. I would say that if you want your game translated, you should hire a translator. But you paid nothing for this game. How are they supposed to fund it?
I don't think they even needed to hire someone who knew Italian, though. Maybe things were different in '05 than they were a few years earlier, but back in my day, if they had gone on the news group and posted, "Hey, in the name of cross-cultural IF, can someone turn our attempted translation into something truly idiomatic?" I'm sure they would have found a volunteer. Someone who could have not only fixed their grammar errors, because they couldn't get a verb form right to save their lives, but who could have told them that, in English, calling a character the Mad Joker sounds kind of weird. Like what, as opposed to the perfectly sane Joker? And it's not just language, it is culture. Humor doesn't really translate well from one culture to another, so maybe a character like the Mad Joker who turns into a bicycle and then into a banana just kills them in Italy, but here it reads a little too much like Katie the Random Penguin of Doom, and someone could have pointed out that it just doesn't work. But on top of that, they could have used an IF-specific editor to point out this game's flaws as a piece of IF. So much of this game is conversation-based, but the conversations could not be more perfunctory. The dialogue options are things like, "Any evidence? Any witnesses?" Though that's probably for the best, because when they do try more than that, they end up with options like, "What about the man meeting the suicide girl?" But that's actually a secondary issue. The primary issue is that if you look at the walkthrough, it just says, "Select all options. Select all options." So you don't make any meaningful choices in these conversations. You basically get to decide whether to greet the characters before you ask, "Any evidence? Any witnesses?" So I got bored of this very quickly and just slogged through the walkthrough to the end of the game. When exactly did you decide that enough was enough?
So there are these interludes where you go back and it keeps reminding you who you are in the game and why you're there. So it was after the second one that I just said, I can sort of see this is just more of the same. I've gotten the feel for the game, and was that picked as a stopping point? No other reason than I had been playing for 2 hours and said, I'm not enjoying this.
And this was originally a comp game, so you were actually supposed to stop after 2 hours. And I think we can stop here. And that wraps it up for Radio K number 9. Many thanks to my guests, Stacey Tappan, Catherine Moriarty, and Melissa Ford, and to the authors of the games, Paul O'Brien, Aaron Reed, Roberto Grassi, Paolo Lucchesi, and Alessandro Peretti. And thank you for listening. Bye for now.